Welcome back to Needle and Thread. I'm Christine Cooper, Manager of Public Programs at the York County History Center. What we're going to work on today is creating a pattern for the dress. I'm going to drape part of it, which means positioning and pinning fabric onto a dress form to develop the pattern pieces. I'm also going to draft some of the pieces, meaning I'm going to use measurements to create flat pattern pieces. This won't be a how-to video. Both draping and drafting are techniques that are better taught in detail. There are plenty of print and online sources out there. And for drafting, I recommend a book called The Pattern Making Primer by Joe Barnfield and Andrew Richards. For draping, there are several online classes that you can sign up for, and even YouTube videos that can help you get started.
Historically, women's dresses and gowns were created by dressmakers or mantua makers that would drape directly onto the woman's body, as we see in this print from the Book of Trades published in London in 1804. To make the pattern, I visited the museum's clothing storage and took measurements of every seam and panel I could find, the widths and lengths of every piece of fabric. I took lots of photos, and I even did some sketching. My dress form is padded out to be my size, which is different than the gown we're making, but I'm only using the form to create the back pieces so that I can get the right shapes. I'll be using the measurements that I took earlier, and that will mean that the pieces will be the right size and not my size. I'm also referencing the photos that I took previously to make sure that the angles and the curves that we find on these individual seams are the same. Once the size and shapes were correctly outlined, I used draping techniques to create the pattern piece. By laying out the material over the form and smoothing and pinning in place, then cutting out that piece, I created a pattern piece that can be used on the fashion fabric of the gown. This is also how I cut the lining of the gown. I drafted the skirt panels and the sleeves of the gown. The sleeves took some trial and error because there were some things that I just had to figure out, especially how to make sure that the sleeve fit properly into the arm side or armhole. During this era, sleeves were set differently than they are today. They were set far into the back of the gown, and that means that I had to draft the sleeve head a little differently than I would on a modern garment. Then, using the measurements of the skirt and remembering to add seam allowance, I made the pieces of the skirt using simple shapes. To draft the pieces, I'm using common drafting tools: a T-square, triangle, French curves, and rulers. I'm drafting the pieces onto craft paper, but you can also buy Swedish tracing paper, which is sewable, feels kind of like a dryer sheet. It's sewable so that you can assemble the garment out of the pattern pieces and adjust them for a perfect fit. It's important before you cut your pieces out of your fabric and your lining fabric that you prepare it. You might need to wash it if it can be washed, and you will certainly need to iron it or press it. You should also make a mock-up. This is a practice piece made from inexpensive fabric. Here you can see mine, sewn from quilting cotton that I had in my fabric stash next to the real garment. I've already cut out my lining, as lining was typically cut out first. It could then be used to check the fit of the garment and make adjustments. The lining in this garment is basically the same shape as the fashion fabric, but instead of using 3 pieces, it's 2 of those pieces being combined into one. And it was also made of linen, which was inexpensive at the time. The linen would be against the skin and protect the silk from perspiration and body oils. To begin, fold the fabric long ways, making sure that the weave is straight. Lay out the pattern pieces on top. Since I cut my pattern pieces the size of the fabric that will show on the outside of the garment, I need to add seam allowance to each piece. In most places, I'm using 1/2 inch. Then secure the pieces to the fabric with pins. I've tried to use as few pins as I possibly can because taffeta tends to show pinholes. Next, trace the pattern pieces. These lines will be the sewing lines. Using a seam gauge, Then measure 1/2 inch from the edge of the pattern piece using a dotted line. This will be the cutting line. With a pair of sharp scissors, we cut along the dotted lines. Once the pieces are cut out, we're ready to begin construction. But we're going to save that for next week. The lines that we drew directly onto the fabric will be on the inside of the garment, and they won't be seen. The original dress was made of copper silk taffeta. I found this silk taffeta online, and it's almost an exact match to the original garment. If you'd like to make your own historically inspired clothing, you'll need to make several choices. First, what are your goals? Are you trying to make something that is as historically accurate as possible, or are you just wanting to make something fun? Both are okay, and even something in between is fine, as long as it makes you happy. Any way you choose to go, you don't need to learn to draft or drape a pattern to begin. There are lots of resources that can make this process easier. There are several great companies that make patterns for historic costumers, and some really good companies for this particular era are Laughing Moon, Fig Leaf Patterns, Mantua Maker, Past Patterns, and Folkwear Patterns. Companies like Butterick and Simplicity also make costume patterns, though these are less historically accurate. The same goes for choosing fabrics. You can buy from companies like Burnley and Trowbridge, Renaissance Fabrics, or William Booth Draper, or simply go to Joann's and find something that catches your eye. Like I said, it's up to you, your goals, and your preferences. Whatever you choose to do, just have fun. Next week, we'll begin assembling the gown, and I'll start hand stitching, and that's really actually the fun part. I'm really looking forward to it. So stay tuned.